"Ma'am, we have to move him." The officer's hand hovered near his belt. Scout stood at the gate with his ears pinned flat, chest low, teeth showing just enough to be understood. 2 years he had held that piece of floor. 2 years of Tuesdays. And now a stranger in a uniform was reaching for the last thing that still belonged to Aaron Doyle. Before this story goes any further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. Carla Doyle didn't remember standing up. 1 second she was on the far side of the boarding lounge with a paper cup of coffee gone cold in her hand. And the next, she was in front of the officer with her palms out saying, "Easy, easy, please, he's not going to hurt anyone. He just doesn't like being touched by people he doesn't know." Her voice was steady, but her knees were not. She had been coming to Gate B14 of Richmond International every Tuesday morning for almost 2 years, and she had never once seen Scout show his teeth at anyone. Not the janitors who mopped around him, not the flight attendants who slipped him pieces of turkey from the crew meals, not even the little boy last October who tripped and landed with both hands on Scout's back, giggling into his fur. Scout had done exactly what a Belgian Malinois with 11 years of Navy training would do. He had held still. He had let the boy find his feet. He had gone back to watching the runway. But this officer was new. He didn't know the rules of B-14. He didn't know that the man who had first tried to leash Scout in late March, 2 marches ago, had walked away with his uniform sleeve torn from wrist to elbow, and a red welt on his forearm that the ER had needed 6 stitches to close. Everyone else who worked the concourse knew. You worked around Scout. You didn't try to make Scout do anything. That was the deal the airport had made with the dog, and the dog had made with the airport, and for the last 2 years that deal had been kept without incident. The new officer's name was Bryce. He was 24 years old, 6 weeks out of training, and he had been told by a supervisor he didn't like that the dog at B-14 was going to be removed today, whether or not the paperwork he had been given made any sense at all. That was the message Bryce had received at 7 in the morning, and by 9 he was standing in front of Scout with a slip lead in his hand and no idea what he was doing. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice cracked on the word, "I have orders." "From who?" Carla asked. She said it quietly. She had learned over the last 2 years that the loudest voice in a room was almost never the one people listened to. She had learned it standing across a kitchen table from a casualty assistance officer with a folder in his hand. She had learned it in the middle of a hospital corridor at Bethesda, when a nurse had asked her to please sit down, and she had refused, because she needed to be standing when the doctor told her whether or not her brother still had both his legs. She had learned that if you said things soft, if you said them slow, people had to lean in, and once they leaned in, they couldn't pretend they hadn't heard. Bryce didn't know all that, but he felt it. He lowered the leash a fraction of an inch. "The manager," he said. "Not Walt, the other one, Mr. Fenner." Carla's stomach turned. She knew that name. Mr. Douglas Fenner had been transferred in from the Atlanta hub 3 weeks earlier to take over regional operations. He was a tall, thin man with a very expensive haircut and the sort of tight, tired smile that people wear when they've stopped expecting to enjoy anything about their day. In his first week, Fenner had walked past Gate B-14 with a clipboard and said out loud, to no one in particular, that the animal at the window was a liability issue and would have to be dealt with by the end of the month. Walt Brewer, standing 10 feet away with a coffee, had said nothing. Walt was not a shouting kind of man. Walt was a fixing kind of man. And Walt had told Carla later that same afternoon that he was going to fix this too, and that she was not to worry. But Walt was not on the concourse this morning. Walt was in a meeting on the far side of the terminal, in a room without windows, being told by 3 lawyers from the airport authority that his loyalty to a dog was starting to interfere with his loyalty to his employer. And while Walt was in that room, Douglas Fenner had sent a rookie officer to Gate B-14 with a slip lead and a lie about a signed order. Scout knew none of this. Scout knew only that the man in front of him had the wrong smell, the wrong step, the wrong hand. Scout had spent 11 years reading men. He had read men in border checkpoints and in dust-walled compounds and in the back of a landing craft at 3 in the morning with the engines running. He could read a man from across a room by the way he shifted his weight. And this man, this young officer with the trembling leash, was going to try again. Scout could feel it in his own chest. Carla saw the dog's ears drop another quarter inch, and she made a decision. She sat down on the tile, right there in the middle of the boarding lounge, in front of 42 waiting passengers and one confused TSA agent. She folded her legs and lowered herself to Scout's level. She reached very slowly for the slip lid in Bryce's hand. "Give me that," she said. Bryce hesitated. "Give me that," she repeated softer, "and go call Walt. Tell him Fenner sent you. Tell him I said to come now." Bryce gave her the lead. He walked away with his shoulders up around his ears. Carla laid the leash flat on the floor beside her, palm down, and put her forehead against Scout's. His breath was warm. He smelled like the vanilla shampoo Dr. Patricia Hess used on him every Thursday. His heartbeat, when she pressed her hand against his ribs, was steady. "He's coming home," she whispered. She had said that to Scout every Tuesday for 113 weeks. She had said it after the casualty assistance officer. She had said it after the first Christmas without her brother. She had said it after the news segment in October, when the whole country had watched Scout stand at the window of B-14 and stare at a runway where nothing was landing. She had said it in April of the second year, when the man from Ohio came with a briefcase and a lawyer's letter claiming that Scout was actually his dog and had been stolen from him in 2018. She had said it in June, when Scout had gone missing for 6 hours, and she had run through the terminal, calling his name until her lungs gave out. She had said it in August, when the phone finally rang at 6 in the morning, and the voice on the other end said the word alive. She had said it every Tuesday, and every Tuesday Scout had turned his head to the window and gone back to waiting. But today was different. Today, Carla knew something Scout did not. Today, in 1 hour and 47 minutes, a commercial flight from Dulles was going to land at gate B-14, and her brother was going to come through that jetway on a cane, and the 2 years were going to end. She had not told anyone else, not even Walt. Aaron had asked her not to. Aaron had said he needed to come home the way he had left, on his own feet, through his own gate, and he had said more than once, in the small, careful voice he had learned to use since the surgeries, that he did not want to be there for a spectacle. He wanted to see the dog. That was all he wanted. He wanted to see the dog, and he wanted the dog to see him, and after that they could figure the rest out. And so today, of all days, Douglas Fenner had chosen to make his move, which meant either Fenner was the most unlucky man in the state of Virginia or someone had told him. Carla lifted her head from Scout's. She looked around the lounge. 42 passengers, 1 TSA agent, a woman in a wheelchair by the window, and standing near the coffee kiosk with a phone to her ear and a very careful expression on her face, a young reporter named Danielle Ortega from the local news station that had aired the original segment 18 months ago. Danielle had been to B-14 a dozen times. Danielle had covered the missing Scout weekend in June and had cried on camera when they found him asleep in a jetway that had been sealed off for maintenance. Danielle liked Scout. Carla had believed that Danielle liked Scout. Danielle was looking directly at Carla when Carla caught her eye, and Danielle looked away. Carla's stomach turned for the second time that morning. She scratched Scout under the chin. His eyes closed a little. He leaned into her hand. Whatever was going to happen in the next hour and 45 minutes, it was going to happen with witnesses, and it was going to happen fast, and Carla was going to have to be very careful with the truth to protect the one thing left in her family that had not broken. She did not yet know that the person who had told Douglas Fenner about Aaron's flight was not the person she suspected. She did not yet know that the man from Ohio, the one with the briefcase and the lawyer's letter, had not gone away. And she did not yet know that in the sealed pocket of her brother's duffel bag, at that very moment being wheeled through baggage claim at Reagan National, was a small brass tag, dented on one side and darkened with age, that had not been out of Aaron Doyle's pocket for the past 2 years and 1 month. And that would explain, when Scout saw it again, why he had chosen this exact piece of floor to hold. To understand any of it, you have to go back to the March morning when everything started. Aaron Doyle was 33 years old that March. He had served 11 years in the United States Navy and 8 in what the paperwork called Special Warfare and what everyone else called the SEALs. He had a small studio apartment in a converted brick warehouse on the south side of Richmond, a used pickup truck with a dented bumper he never bothered to fix, and a sister who worked as a pediatric nurse at the Children's Hospital downtown. He had no wife, no children, no plants that could die if he was gone too long. He had Scout. Scout had come to him 5 years earlier as a working dog assigned to his team, and had come to him permanently 2 years earlier when the joint injury in Scout's left shoulder had ended the animal's active service. The Navy did not usually let a handler adopt his working dog, but Scout was a special case, and Aaron had submitted a special request, and the request had, against all reasonable expectation, been granted. Scout had ridden home from Virginia Beach in the passenger seat of the pickup, with his head out the window and his eyes half closed, and Aaron had promised him, out loud, on the interstate, that he was never going to work another day in his life. Scout had proceeded to work every day of his retirement. He worked at teaching Aaron how to sleep past 4 in the morning. He worked at teaching Aaron how to sit still in a chair. He worked at teaching Aaron how to accept touch from someone he trusted, which was a skill Aaron had been very careful not to develop for a very long time. Scout was patient. He had no other job. He would rest his heavy head on Aaron's knee, and he would breathe, slow and warm, and he would wait, and eventually, always, Aaron's shoulders would come down. The night before the deployment, Aaron had sat on the floor of his apartment with Scout across his lap. Carla had been on the couch pretending to read. The 3 of them had eaten pizza from a box and watched an old baseball game that neither of them cared about. Around 11, Aaron had leaned down and put his forehead against Scout's. He had held it there for a long time. Then he had taken off the brass tag he wore on a chain around his neck, the tag Scout had worn as a military working dog, the tag with Scout's Navy service number stamped on one side and Aaron's call sign scratched into the other, the tag Scout had come home wearing on the day his retirement papers were signed, and he had closed his fist around it. "I'm going to bring this back to you," he had said to the dog quietly, so Carla wouldn't hear. "You understand me? I'm going to bring this back. You wait for me." Scout had looked at him. Scout had licked once the knuckle that held the tag. The next morning, at 5, Aaron and Carla drove to the airport in the dark. Aaron had ordered Scout to stay in the truck. Scout had, for the first time in 5 years, refused. Scout had followed them, at a distance of exactly 1 leash length, all the way across the parking garage, up the elevator, through the terminal, and into the boarding lounge at Gate B14, where the ground crew was pulling the jet bridge into place for the 6:40 military charter to Norfolk. Carla had the leash. Aaron had a small green duffel and a coffee. They had said everything they had to say to each other already, over the pizza, so at the gate they had just stood there, the 3 of them, watching the sun come up grey through the window. When they called the flight, Aaron had knelt down. "You wait for me," he had said, out loud this time, and Scout had put his muzzle in the pocket of Aaron's jacket, the pocket where the brass tag was, and had held it there. Then Aaron had stood up and walked into the jetway without looking back. That was the last thing Scout saw him do. He tore the leash out of Carla's hand 3 seconds later. Not out of panic, not with a lunge, just a low, hard pull that Carla's wrist was not prepared for, and the leather was gone. and Scout was crossing the polished tile toward the closing door of the jetway at a controlled, terrible pace. He got there just as the door sealed. He put his nose against the crack. He stood there. He didn't bark. He didn't scratch. He stood there breathing with his eyes on the seam of the door, and when the ground crew tried, 40 minutes later, to walk him to the exit, he showed them what a Belgian Malinois with 11 years of Navy training does when a stranger tries to move him from a position he has been told to hold. Aaron's last words to him had been 3. "You wait for me." Scout had waited. The first week, they thought he would get tired. The second week, they thought he would get thirsty. He did neither. Airport workers began, without being told to bring him bowls of water from the kitchens behind the food court. The morning shift left him a shallow tray of dry kibble that a first officer had bought at a pet store on his way in. A gate agent named Angela Vasquez, who had a bulldog at home with a heart condition, brought him a folded quilted blanket from her own linen closet and laid it against the wall under the departures board. By the end of the first month, everyone on the sea concourse knew that the wall under the B-14 departures board was Scout's wall. They swept around him. They stepped over him. They apologized when their carry-ons rolled too close. Carla came every day for the first 2 weeks. Then, because she had a job and rent and a car payment, and her hands were beginning to shake in the operating theater at the Children's Hospital, she came every Tuesday morning. The Tuesday was not arbitrary. Tuesday was the day Aaron had left. Tuesday was the day Scout, at 10:47 a.m., always turned his face to the window and stared unblinking at a piece of tarmac that on some Tuesdays held a plane and on most Tuesdays did not. Carla learned to sit on the floor beside him at 10:47 and to say quietly, "He's coming home." She said it because she needed to hear it out loud. She said it because she did not know how else to say it. The word MIA reached her in July, 4 months after the flight, in the shape of an olive-drab government sedan idling in front of her apartment building. She had made the officer come inside to say it. She had made him say it, standing up in her kitchen with the light on. She had thanked him and offered him coffee, which he had refused, and shown him out. Then she had walked to the bathroom and been sick. She had gone to the airport that afternoon and told Scout. She had said the words "alive" and MIA and "I don't know," and Scout had listened, and then Scout had gone back to watching the window. Carla had understood, sitting on that tile with her hand on the dog's back, that Scout had not been operating on any word she had said in months. Scout was operating on the last thing Aaron had said to him, and Scout was going to keep operating on it until Aaron came back to countermand it. The local news segment ran in October. Danielle Ortega had picked up the story from a passenger who had posted a photograph of Scout in his blanket under the departures board to a social media account that had gone accidentally viral. The passenger had, mercifully, not tagged the airport. Danielle had done her homework. She had gotten Carla's permission before filming. She had promised and kept the promise not to say the word SEAL on air. She had used the phrase "military member of the Doyle family." She had cut the piece to 2 minutes and 18 seconds. She had ended it with Scout at the window and no music. The piece aired at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday in the second week of October, and by 7, the airport switchboard was overwhelmed. Some of the calls were from people offering to drive to Richmond and adopt Scout. Some were from veterans in other states writing to say they understood. One, at 7:41, was from a man in Dayton, Ohio, named Roger Halston. Roger Halston said into the phone that the dog on the news had been stolen from his kennel in 2018 and that he intended to reclaim him. He said it very calmly. Walt Brewer, who had answered the phone himself because it was after hours and he was still in the office, told Mr. Halston that if he had a claim, he was welcome to bring it in, writing, on paper, with documentation, to Walt personally, and that if the documentation was legitimate, the airport would cooperate. Then Walt hung up and sat in his chair and thought for a while, and then he called Dr. Patricia Hess and asked her to come see the dog first thing in the morning. Dr. Patricia Hess was 59 years old, and she had been the head veterinarian at the county animal shelter for 22 years. She was a wide, calm woman with a grey braid to her waist and reading glasses that she kept on a beaded chain because she was always losing them. She arrived at the airport at 6:30 the following morning with a soft, rolling case and a thermos of coffee and no assistant. Walt walked her down to gate B14 and stood back. "Hi, honey," Dr. Hess said to Scout. Scout looked at her. His ears did not go back. His weight did not shift. He had, over the previous 6 months, learned to accept the smell of iodine and the click of a stethoscope. He had learned to accept, more slowly, the touch of a hand along his hip. He did not accept these things from strangers. He accepted them from Dr. Hess. She had, that October morning, 3 tasks. She was going to give Scout his booster shots. She was going to check the shoulder injury that had ended his working career. And she was going to check, without letting Walt notice she was doing it, the microchip in Scout's scruff. The microchip was a small glass cylinder about the size of a grain of rice, injected between his shoulder blades when he was 9 weeks old. It contained a 15-digit registration number. The number, when Dr. Hess ran her scanner over it that morning, matched the number on the paperwork that Aaron had filed when he adopted Scout out of the Navy. It also matched a Navy military working dog service number. It did not match anything in Roger Halston's kennel records in Dayton, Ohio. Dr. Hess wrote the number down. She wrote it in pencil in the back of a notebook she had carried for 22 years, and she circled it twice, and she went upstairs and told Walt that the dog belonged to Aaron Doyle, full stop. Then she asked quietly whether Aaron Doyle was still alive. Walt Brewer, who had also served, said he did not know, and that Carla did not know, and that they were waiting. Dr. Hess said she would come back next Thursday, and the Thursday after that. She said she would come back every Thursday until somebody told her different. She kept the appointment for 103 consecutive Thursdays. She never charged the airport a dime. Roger Halston's letter arrived in November, on the letterhead of a law firm in Cincinnati that Walt had never heard of. It contained, as promised, documentation. It contained photographs of a black-masked Belgian Malinois with a notched left ear, standing in what appeared to be a kennel. It contained a bill of sale dated April 29, 2017, purporting to show that Roger Halston had purchased the dog, whom he had named Kaiser, from a breeder in Kentucky. It contained a police report from 2018 alleging that the dog had been stolen from the kennel by a former employee. It contained an offer, at the end, to accept $25,000 from the airport authority in exchange for surrendering the claim. Walt read the letter twice. Then he called the law firm in Cincinnati and asked for the lawyer whose name was on the letterhead, and was told by a receptionist that the lawyer had left the firm 18 months earlier and was no longer practicing. Walt asked how the letter had been produced. The receptionist put him on hold. When she came back, she was flustered, and she asked him not to call again. Walt drove to the sheriff's office that afternoon and had a long, private conversation with a deputy he had known for 20 years. He also called Dr. Hess and asked her to bring the microchip scanner and her notebook, and to write down, in front of a witness, the 15-digit registration number and the date of her scan. Dr. Hess did. Then Walt did something that surprised him even as he did it. He drove to Carla's apartment. He knocked on her door. He sat on her couch with a glass of water, and he told her gently that a man in Ohio was going to try to take her brother's dog, and that Walt was not going to let him, but that Walt wanted her to know before it hit the news. Carla listened. She did not cry. She was, at that point in her life, past the ability to cry in front of other people. She thanked him. Then, without meaning to, she asked him a question she had been carrying for 3 months. "Walt," she said, "why are you doing this?" Walt Brewer looked at his glass of water for a while. Then he said, in the small, careful voice of a man who did not usually talk about himself, that he had been an air traffic controller for 26 years before he had taken the management job at Richmond, and that he had, in his 16th year, guided a Marine Corps helicopter carrying his own son, a young lance corporal, into landing at Camp Lejeune. His son had walked off the ramp of that helicopter alive. His son had walked off the ramp because a Marine dog, whose name Walt had never learned, had 48 hours earlier, in a village whose name Walt could not pronounce, sniffed out a device buried under the door his son was about to kick in. The dog had done its job. The dog had gone back to the kennel. The dog had died 2 years later of old age in a fenced yard in Oceanside, California. Walt had gone to visit the grave once on a trip in 2014. He had brought flowers which felt stupid, and he had left them anyway. "That's why," Walt said finally. "I don't owe you anything. I don't owe your brother anything. I owe a dog I never met." Carla did cry then. Not much. She wiped it off with the heel of her hand and offered Walt more water, and Walt said no, thank you, and got up and left. On his way out, he said, over his shoulder, that he was going to fight the Ohio claim and that he would win, and that she was not to talk to anyone from that law firm, from any law firm, or from any news station without calling him first. She agreed. She kept the agreement, mostly. She told Danielle Ortega in a quiet phone call the following week that there was a legal matter she couldn't discuss, but that she trusted Walt. Danielle said she understood. Danielle asked, very gently, whether there had been any news about Aaron. Carla said no. Danielle promised she would not run any follow-up pieces without Carla's permission. Danielle kept that promise too, until she didn't. The winter was hard. The concourse was cold in the mornings, and Scout began for the first time to shiver. Walt had heating panels installed under the tile at B-14 at his own expense without telling the airport authority. Dr. Hess added a fleece liner to Scout's blanket. Angela Vasquez brought him a small stuffed toy shaped like a moose, which Scout ignored, and then, one Tuesday in February, silently pulled onto the blanket beside him and began to sleep against. Carla brought a photograph of Aaron from her wallet in March and held it up in front of Scout. Scout looked at it. Scout sniffed the corner. Then Scout, very slowly, laid his muzzle across Carla's wrist, and Carla understood that he had recognized the photograph and that he was, in the only way he knew how, telling her not to worry. Roger Holston's claim collapsed in April. The sheriff's deputy Walt had spoken with had done exactly what he said he was going to do, which was call the sheriff's office in Dayton and ask politely about a kennel owned by a Roger Holston. The Dayton office had been happy to talk. There was, as it turned out, no kennel. There had been a kennel once, in 2015, run by a Roger Holston, and it had been shut down for reasons involving unpaid taxes and unregistered animals, and, on one memorable occasion, a raid by Animal Control that had removed 9 dogs and issued 12 citations. Roger Holston had subsequently reinvented himself as a professional witness in animal claim cases. He had, in the previous 2 years, attempted to take ownership of 4 different dogs that had been the subject of news coverage. He had succeeded exactly once, with a small mixed breed in Michigan whose actual owner had been unable to afford a lawyer. Walt sent Roger Holston's attorney a very short letter through the sheriff's office. He did not offer $25,000. He suggested that if Roger Holston ever set foot in the state of Virginia with the intention of pursuing this claim, the sheriff would be glad to meet him at the border. Roger Holston went quiet. Carla and Walt allowed themselves for one Tuesday morning to sit on the floor of Gate B-14 with coffee and to feel something close to relief, which was when Aaron went missing for real. Up until that point, Aaron had been officially MIA for 11 months. That was, in the strange, cruel arithmetic of casualty notification, a category that could hold him. The word missing meant, technically, that no confirmation of death had been recovered. It also meant technically that no confirmation of life had been recovered. Carla had learned over those 11 months to hold on to the missing the way you hold on to a candle in a wind, cupping it, turning your body around it, trying not to breathe on it too hard. She had gotten used to living inside that word. Then, in the 4th week of April, a casualty assistance officer had shown up at her apartment, and he had said the word confirmed, and Carla had not been ready. Her knees went. He caught her at the elbow. He walked her to the couch. She sat. He sat opposite her in the same wing chair her mother used to sit in when she visited, and he laid a folder on the coffee table between them, and he opened his mouth to say the second word. Then he stopped. Then he closed his mouth. Then he said, more slowly, that the confirmation was of life and not of death, and that Aaron had been recovered alive in the small hours of that morning from a compound in a country the officer was not permitted to name. Aaron had been held for 6 months and 3 weeks, and they thought 2 days. He had, in the officer's careful language, injuries consistent with prolonged captivity. He was being transported at that moment to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. From Landstuhl, he would be transferred to Bethesda. He would live. He would walk again, probably. His hearing on one side was likely to be affected permanently. He had asked from a hospital bed in Germany when he could see his dog. Carla sat on that couch for a very long time. She did not remember what she said to the officer. She remembered later that she had shaken his hand very hard, and that she had at some point pressed her palm against her mouth so hard that the shape of her own tooth was still visible in her lip an hour later. She drove to the airport at 4 in the morning. She had not called ahead. She had not needed to. Walt was in his office. Walt was almost always in his office at 4 in the morning by then, because Walt had, at some point during the winter, moved a folding cot into a storage room down the hall and had stopped bothering to drive home most nights. Walt saw her face when she came through the doors, and he understood, immediately, the wrong way. And he stood up so fast, he knocked his coffee onto the carpet. "He's alive," Carla said. "Walt, he's alive." Walt sat back down. He put both hands flat on the desk. He looked at the ceiling. He said, very quietly, "Thank God." And then he stood up again, and he walked with her, without speaking, all the way down to gate B14. Scout was sleeping on his blanket in the soft yellow puddle of the emergency lighting. His head was on his paws. His breathing was slow. Carla sat down beside him and put her cheek against his neck. His fur was warm. He smelled like the vanilla shampoo Dr. Hess had used the previous Thursday. He did not stir. "He's alive," Carla whispered into the dog's ear. "He's alive, honey. He's coming home." Scout's ear twitched once. He kept sleeping. She stayed there until the sun came up. When the morning crew arrived, she stood up, kissed the top of Scout's head, and told Walt she was going to Bethesda that afternoon, and that she would call him from the road. Walt said, "All right." Walt said, "Drive safe." Walt said at the door, without looking at her, that he would take good care of the dog. Carla nodded and left. She did not know that morning that the recovery of her brother from a compound in a country the officer had not named was going to become, in a matter of days, a story that other people wanted to own. Aaron's recovery took 11 months. 2 surgeries on the femur, which had been shattered at the top of the shaft. 6 weeks of screws and cages before the first replacement rod could be seated. Then a bacterial infection that pushed the second surgery back by 3 weeks and dropped his weight below 140 pounds for the first time since he'd been 15 years old. Physical therapy that started with the therapist moving his knee for him, because he couldn't. A wheelchair in the 2nd month, a walker in the 5th, a cane in the 8th, then the transfer in the 9th month to the rehabilitation unit at the VA hospital in Richmond, an hour's drive from Carla's apartment. He refused the entire 11 months to look at any video of Scout. Carla brought her phone the first time she visited him at Bethesda, and she said gently, "I brought something." And Aaron shook his head. He said hoarsely, No, he said, either I see him in person or I don't see him at all. Carla put the phone away. He asked every visit whether Scout was still at the gate. He asked it the way a man asks whether the tide is still coming in. He was not really asking. He was checking that the world had not gone soft on him. Yes, Carla said, every visit. Scout is still at the gate. She did not tell him about Roger Halston. She did not tell him about Douglas Fenner, who had, in month 6 of Aaron's recovery, been transferred to Richmond and had begun immediately to make noise about the animal at B14. She did not tell him about the second national news cycle in July, when a talk show host on a cable network had run a segment on Scout without permission and had, in a 2-minute monologue, gotten most of the facts wrong. She did not tell him about the woman from Los Angeles who had shown up at the concourse in August with a documentary crew, or about the online petition demanding that Scout be given a congressional medal, or about the letter Walt had received from an animal rights organization in New York, demanding that Scout be removed from the airport immediately for his own welfare and placed in a sanctuary. She kept it all off him. She did not want any of it in his hospital room. She wanted him to have one clean thing to walk toward, and she had decided, without saying so out loud, that the clean thing was going to be the dog on the tile at gate B14. He asked her, one afternoon in month 9, when he was already off the walker and had begun to try the cane, whether Scout would still recognize him. Carla had thought about her answer for a long time before she gave it. She had thought about the weight her brother could carry and what she wanted him to carry into that terminal. Finally, she had said, yes. She had said it flatly. She had said, he's never stopped waiting, and that was as much as she was willing to promise, because she was a nurse, and she knew better than to promise more than she could deliver. He nodded. He did not ask any more questions about the dog for 2 weeks. Then one Sunday, he asked her whether he could see his old duffel. Carla had brought it to him. She had kept it all those months on the top shelf of her hall closet, unopened, exactly as it had come home from Landstuhl in a plastic bag the size of a laundry sack. She had brought it to his room in the rehab unit, and she had put it on the chair by the window, and she had left him alone with it for an hour. When she came back, Aaron was sitting on the edge of the bed with the duffel between his knees, and he was holding, in his left hand, a small brass tag on a thin steel chain. His eyes were closed. His mouth was open a little. He was not making a sound. Carla sat down next to him and did not speak. After a long time, he opened his eyes. I told him I'd bring it back, he said. I told him to wait. Carla, who had thought she was finished crying about her brother, discovered she was not. He closed his fist around the tag. He put the chain around his own neck. He tucked the tag inside his hospital gown. One more thing, he said. I want to come home through B14. Carla nodded. She did not point out that this would be complicated. She did not point out that his surgeons would want him in a medical transport. She did not point out that a commercial airline would need to be told in advance that a passenger with a cane and a severe hip and a paperwork trail was going to require boarding assistance. She said, all right. She said, I will make it happen. And she went home that night and began the process of making it happen. The complication, when it came, was Danielle Ortega. Danielle had, over the previous 8 months, stayed away from the story. She had, in fact, turned down 2 national producers who had wanted to pay for her local footage. She had said both times that the family was not ready. She had meant it. But Danielle had also, in the previous 6 months, become a rising figure at her station and had been offered in April a spot at the anchor desk that she wanted very badly. And the news director who was offering her the spot had, in a not very subtle way, made her understand that the offer would firm up if she brought the Scout story home. If she was there when the SEAL walked through the jetway, if she got the reunion on tape. That was the phrase he had used, the reunion on tape. Danielle had thought about it for 2 weeks. Then, in early August, she had done something that she would spend the rest of her life trying to explain to herself. She had called a source she knew at the VA hospital in Richmond, and she had asked, without asking, whether Aaron Doyle was still on the schedule for a September discharge. The source, who was an old college roommate of hers and who trusted her, had confirmed. Danielle had thanked her. Then Danielle had called an assistant in Walt's office, a young woman named Priya, and had asked, without asking, whether the airport had been notified of any medical accommodation requests for a returning veteran. Priya had told her that yes, one had come in, and that it was tied to a specific commercial flight from Dulles, landing at B-14 on the third Tuesday of September at 11:47 a.m. Danielle had written down the flight number. She had, that same night, called Douglas Fenner, whom she had met once at a Chamber of Commerce dinner, and she had, without saying anything about the flight, asked him about the airport's policy on emotional support animals in public boarding areas. Fenner had been happy to talk. He had, over the course of a 20-minute conversation, made it clear that he had opinions about a certain animal at Gate B-14 and that he was going to take action before the end of the summer. He had not asked why Danielle was interested. Danielle had listened and made small, sympathetic sounds, and by the end of the call she had understood, in a way she could not have understood the day before, that if a certain man in a uniform showed up at Gate B-14 with a leash on the third Tuesday of September at 11 a.m., there would be a scene, and a scene, on camera, live, before the veteran walked off the plane, was going to be a much bigger story than a quiet reunion. Danielle had said goodnight to Douglas Fenner. She had hung up. She had sat at her kitchen table for a very long time. She had told herself out loud that she was not going to do anything with the information. She had told herself out loud that Douglas Fenner was going to do whatever he was going to do without her. Then 2 weeks later, she had sent Douglas Fenner an email confirming the flight number without a subject line, without a signature, and had told herself that this was not the same as making a call. She had believed that for about 8 hours. Then she had thrown up in her kitchen sink. She had gone to work anyway. She had gone to the airport that Tuesday morning anyway. She had stood at the coffee kiosk with her phone to her ear anyway. And when Carla Doyle looked up from the tile at Gate B-14 and caught her eye, Danielle had looked away and had realized in a small hot rush behind her sternum that this was going to be the worst thing she had ever done. It was 10:23 in the morning. The flight from Dulles was scheduled to land in 1 hour and 24 minutes. Scout was still lying on his blanket with his head across Carla's knee. Bryce, the young officer, had by now found his way to the operations office and had been told by an assistant that Walt Brewer was in a meeting and could not be interrupted. Bryce had, to his credit, insisted. He had gotten the meeting room number. He had walked down the hall. He had knocked on the door. He had opened it and stuck his head in and said, "Sir Miz, Doyle told me to come get you." And Walt Brewer, in the middle of a sentence with 3 lawyers, had stopped talking and stood up and walked out of the room without so much as picking up his notebook. "Which lounge?" Walt said in the corridor. "B-14, Bryce said. "There's a woman with a camera phone at the coffee thing." Walt started to walk faster. Then he started to run. He ran the last 100 yards of the concourse. He ran past the smoothie stand and the news stand and the little souvenir shop that sold Virginia peanuts in tin cans. He ran into Gate B-14 with his tie flying and his badge banging against his ribs, and he pulled up short in the middle of the boarding lounge, and he saw Carla on the floor with Scout, Danielle Ortega at the coffee kiosk with her phone raised, Douglas Fenner standing beside the departures board, in a very expensive suit, watching Danielle Ortega with the expression of a man who had come to see a show and was disappointed with the seating. And a second security officer, whom Walt did not know, standing behind Douglas Fenner with an animal control kit in his hand. Walt took in the entire tableau in about 2 seconds. Then he walked at a normal pace over to Douglas Fenner. "Doug," he said, Douglas Fenner turned. He smiled the tight, tired smile. "Walt," he said, "I was just about to send for you." "I bet you were," Walt said. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He said quietly that the meeting with the lawyers had concluded 3 minutes early because Walt had left. He said that the meeting had ended before Walt had left, with the airport authorities' general counsel confirming, on the record, that Walt's handling of the animal at gate B14 was consistent with policy and would not be the basis for disciplinary action. He said that the general counsel had also confirmed in the same meeting that any employee who attempted to remove the animal from the gate without a signed and dated order from the general counsel's own office would be committing an act of insubordination. Then Walt turned, without waiting for Fenner to answer, and walked over to the second security officer and put his hand on the animal control kit and took it out of the officer's hand. He said, "Thank you, John." And John, whose name was not John, said nothing and walked away. Walt walked back to Fenner. He held the kit in one hand. He looked at Fenner's tie. "Doug," he said, "go back to your office. Don't come back down here today. Don't come back down here on any Tuesday for the next month. If you have a problem with that, put it in writing and send it to the general counsel, not to me." Fenner's tight smile went a little tighter. He said, "Well, Walt, we're going to have a conversation about this next week." Walt said, "We can." And then he walked past Fenner and squatted down beside Carla and Scout and said out loud, "All right, girl, all right. You okay?" Carla said, "Yeah." She said it very quietly. She said, "Walt, Danielle is filming us." Walt looked up. Danielle had lowered the phone by about 6 inches. Her face was very white. She was not filming at that moment, but she had been. She had been filming for at least 40 seconds, from the moment Bryce had walked back onto the concourse to the moment Walt had run in. Walt stood up. He walked slowly across the lounge until he was standing directly in front of the coffee kiosk. He did not look at Danielle. He looked at the woman behind the counter, whose name was Rita, and he said, "Rita, could you give us a minute?" Rita said, "Sure, Walt," and stepped into the back. Walt turned to Danielle. He said, "Give me the phone." Danielle said, "Walt." He said, "Give me the phone, Danielle, or leave the terminal. Those are your 2 options." She gave him the phone. He looked at the screen. He did not know how to work it, but he found on the top row of icons a red circle he had seen in enough offices to recognize. He tapped it. He tapped it again. He held out the phone. "Delete the video," he said. "All of it, everything from this morning. Do it while I watch." Danielle's hands were shaking. She took the phone. She did what he asked. She turned the screen toward him after each deletion. He nodded once at each one. When she was done, he took the phone back, turned it off, and put it in his own pocket. "You can have this at the end of the day," he said. "In my office, you will come alone. You will not bring a colleague. You will not bring a lawyer. You and I are going to have a conversation about what you did." Danielle nodded. She could not speak. Walt walked back to Carla. He sat down on the tile beside her, groaning a little at his knees. Scout, without moving his body, shifted his eyes and looked at Walt for a long moment. Then he blinked. Then he looked away. The clock over the gate said 10:31. The flight from Dulles was scheduled to land in 1 hour and 16 minutes. "Walt," Carla said, "someone told Fenner about the flight." "Yeah," Walt said. "I figured that out about a minute ago." "Who?" Walt looked at the ceiling. "I don't know for sure," he said, "but I have a guess." He did not, at that moment, tell her his guess. He had a very small suspicion, based on nothing but the fact that Priya, his assistant, had been very upset that morning when he came in, and that Priya had been avoiding his eye ever since. He was going to talk to Priya later. He was not going to guess out loud until he was sure. The truth, when it eventually came out, was slightly different from Walt's guess. Priya had, in fact, spoken to Danielle. Priya had done so because Danielle had been kind to her the previous November when Priya's sister had been in a car accident, and Danielle had helped her get a piece of local coverage for a hospital fundraiser. Priya had thought she was doing Danielle a small favor. Priya had not, until the following week, understood what she had actually done. Walt would eventually forgive Priya. He would not fire her. He would sit her down in his office and he would explain to her very slowly that the price of a small favor from a reporter is always paid in the end by someone else. Priya would remember that conversation for the rest of her career. But that would come later. On the tile at B14 at 10:31 on that Tuesday morning, none of it had been sorted out. There was only Carla and Walt and Scout and the long, tight hour that was still ahead of them. Then, at 10:37, the second thing that Carla had not expected to happen that morning happened. A man in a wheelchair rolled up to gate B14 with a small green duffel across his knees. Aaron Doyle had gotten off the plane at Dulles 90 minutes early. He had done it, he would explain later, because he had woken up at 3 in the morning at the rehab unit and had understood, without being told, that today was going to be harder than he had planned. He had understood that Scout, who had waited 2 years without any help from him, was still waiting, and that the 50 extra minutes he had built into his own schedule to gather himself in the terminal at Dulles were 50 minutes that Scout should not be asked to wait through. He had asked the rehab unit to move him to a chartered medical flight that was going into Reagan National, and from Reagan a car had brought him to Dulles. And at Dulles, a very kind gate agent had, without asking too many questions, put him on the next commercial flight to Richmond, which had landed at 10:29. He had been in a wheelchair, on his own request, because the walk from the jetway to the concourse was longer than he was going to be able to make on a cane if he wanted to have anything left for what came next. He rolled up to gate B14 at 10:37 a.m. He was not expected. Nobody at the gate saw him coming because everyone at the gate was looking at Scout. The wheelchair's wheels made almost no noise on the tile. Aaron stopped 10 feet from Carla's back. He put his hand up. He said softly, "Hey." Carla turned. She saw her brother, thinner than she had ever seen him, cheekbones sharp, a raw pink scar starting under his ear and disappearing into his collar. A cane laid across the arms of the wheelchair, the brass tag at his throat on the outside of his shirt now catching the fluorescent light. She said, in a voice she did not recognize, "You're early." Aaron said, "I couldn't make him wait any longer." And then, beside her, Scout lifted his head. Scout had lifted his head thousands of times over the previous 2 years. He had lifted it at the sound of the departures announcements. He had lifted it at the smell of turkey from crew meals. He had lifted it once at a whistled scrap of an old sea shanty that a maintenance worker had been unwittingly humming on his way past the gate. He had lifted his head every time, and every time had looked, and every time had put his head back down. This time was different. This time his head came up all the way and his ears came forward and his weight shifted. He was on his feet before Carla registered it. He did not scramble. He did not bark. He walked at his controlled working pace, straight past Carla, straight past Walt, straight past Douglas Fenner, who by then had frozen with his hand on the departures board and his mouth open, and straight to the wheelchair. He put his muzzle against Aaron's jaw. He held it there. Aaron dropped the cane. He dropped the duffel. He put both hands on the dog's head. His forehead came down against the top of Scout's skull, and his shoulders shook once, hard. Scout did not move. Aaron slid slowly out of the wheelchair. He put his good knee down on the tile. He put his other leg out to the side gingerly because he could not fold it under him. He wrapped both arms around the dog, and Scout, without a sound, pressed his whole body into Aaron's chest. Then Aaron, with a hand that had not been steady in 11 months, took the brass tag off his own neck. He held it up between 2 fingers so Scout could see it. Scout's eyes tracked it. Scout's ears did not move. "I brought it back," Aaron said. "I told you I would." He slid the chain over Scout's head. He settled the tag against the dog's chest. Scout leaned harder. Carla was crying. Walt was crying. Bryce, at the back of the lounge, was crying. Priya, who had walked down from the operations office at 10:30 because Walt had asked her to come find him and had frozen 20 feet from the gate when she saw the wheelchair, was crying. Douglas Fenner was standing very still. Danielle Ortega, who had backed away from the coffee kiosk without picking up her purse, had one hand pressed over her mouth. She was not filming. She was not going to film. She would remember for the rest of her life that she had not filmed. The clock over the gate said 10:41. The flight from Dulles that Aaron had originally been booked on was still an hour and 6 minutes out. Aaron stayed on the floor for a long time. Nobody rushed him. Nobody moved. When he finally lifted his head from Scout's neck, he looked for the first time at his sister. "Hi," he said quietly. Carla laughed. It came out wet and broken. "Hi," she said back. He held one hand out to her. She crawled the 2 feet across the tile on her knees, and he pulled her into the hug with Scout, and the three of them sat there on the floor at Gate B14 of Richmond International Airport, while the fluorescent lights hummed and the departures board ticked over, and far away the morning flight from Charlotte began its descent. The three of them stayed there for 11 minutes. Then Walt cleared his throat softly and said, "Aaron, if you'll let me, I'd like to help you up." Aaron said yes. Walt got under one of his arms. Bryce, who had come forward without being asked, got under the other. Between them, they lifted Aaron back into the wheelchair. Scout stood pressed against Aaron's knee the whole time. When Aaron was seated, Scout laid his head across Aaron's thigh and left it there. Carla picked up the duffel. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She looked at Douglas Fenner. Douglas Fenner looked back at her. He opened his mouth. He closed his mouth. He turned without a word and walked toward the elevator. He did not, in the end, return to Gate B14. He submitted his resignation to the regional director the following Monday morning, citing personal reasons, and took a job at a smaller airport in North Carolina 3 weeks later. Walt heard about the resignation from a friend on the authority board, and for the space of one afternoon permitted himself to smile. Danielle Ortega came into Walt's office at the end of the day, alone, as she had been told. Walt handed her the phone back on the top of his desk. He did not turn it on. He did not need to. He said, "One thing, Danielle." She said, "Yes." He said, "If you write about this, write about Aaron, not about the dog." She said, "All right." She said, "I don't deserve it, but all right." Walt nodded and told her she could go. She went. She wrote 3 months later a long piece for a national magazine about her own role in the events at Gate B14. She named herself. She named her news director. She did not name Priya. She refused the anchor spot at her station and took instead a job at a smaller outlet in a smaller market, where she covered county council meetings for the next 6 years. She was, by every account of the people who worked with her there, a good and careful reporter. She never covered a story with an animal in it again. Dr. Patricia Hess drove out to Aaron's apartment the day after the reunion with her rolling case and her thermos and no assistant, and she gave Scout his checkup on Aaron's living room floor. Aaron on the couch watched her work. Scout let her do everything. When she was done, she stood up and she looked at Aaron, and she said in her wide, calm voice that he was a very lucky man, and that his dog was a very lucky dog, and that both of them had a lot of work to do to get used to being in the same room again. Aaron said, "Yes, Mom," Dr. Hess said. "I'll come back next Thursday and every Thursday after that until you tell me to stop." Aaron said, "I don't think I'm going to tell you to stop." She said, "Well, all right then." She kept the standing appointment for the next 4 years until she retired. Walt Brewer did not retire. Walt Brewer had, before the events of that Tuesday, been considering it. He had a wife who wanted him to see more of her, and grandchildren who were growing up in a town 2 hours away, and a bad hip that told him every winter it was time. He had a folder in his desk with the paperwork half filled out. He kept the folder. He did not fill it out. He worked another 5 years at Richmond International. He was, everyone at the airport agreed, a different man in those 5 years, softer and quieter, and a little more inclined to sit down for coffee with people he used to walk past. He never said out loud what had changed. He didn't need to. Nobody who had been at Gate B14 on that Tuesday morning needed him to say it. Roger Halston tried one more time to sell a claim on Scout to a national tabloid a year and a half after the reunion. The tabloid, checking the story, called Walt. Walt gave them the sheriff's office in Dayton. The tabloid did not run the piece. Roger Halston did not surface again. Bryce, the young officer, did not stay in security. He applied 4 months after that Tuesday to a K-9 training program in North Carolina. He was at first rejected. He applied again the following year with a letter of recommendation from Walt Brewer that ran to 2 full pages. He was accepted. He graduated 9th in his class. He is, at this writing, working with a Belgian Malinois of his own at a mid-sized airport in the Midwest, and he tells anyone who will listen that he chose the breed because of a dog he once tried to leash in Virginia when he was too young to know better. Priya, whom Walt did not fire, stayed with him for 3 more years and then went back to school for a degree in hospital administration. She sent Walt a card at his retirement party. Walt kept the card in the same folder where he had once kept the retirement paperwork. Carla went back to work at the Children's Hospital in the 2nd week of October, after 2 full weeks of family leave that her supervisor had told her, gently but firmly, she was going to take whether she wanted to or not. The tremor in her hands, which had begun in the 8th month of Aaron's captivity and had grown steadily worse over the following 10 months, was gone within 30 days. She did not remember later exactly when she noticed. She only remembered that one morning in November she was scrubbing in for a procedure, and she looked down at her own hands and her thumbs were still, and she thought, and then she washed them and went to work. Aaron's recovery once he was home went both faster and slower than his doctors predicted. The femur, once it had a dog to walk with, stopped bothering him quite so much. The hearing on his right side never came back. He did not, in the end, mind. He had spent 11 years listening for things he did not want to hear. He was, he told Carla once, over dinner, ready to spend the rest of his life listening for smaller things. A leash rattling, a tail hitting a chair leg, the dry click of Scout's claws on the kitchen tile at 6 in the morning, walking up to the side of the bed, waiting to be told it was time to go for a walk. He walked Scout every morning for the next 9 years in every kind of weather, until Scout, at the age of 14, could no longer manage the block, and Aaron began, instead, to carry him halfway and let him walk the rest. Scout died in the spring of that 9th year in Aaron's arms, on the rug in Aaron's living room, with Dr. Patricia Hess, who had come out of retirement for the visit, holding his back paw. He went quietly. He was ready. He had, at that point, been Aaron's dog for 16 years, 3 of them working, 13 of them retired, and he had spent the middle 2 of those retired years holding a piece of floor at Gate B14 of Richmond International Airport for a man who was, however slowly, coming home. Aaron kept the brass tag. He wore it on the same steel chain for the rest of his life. He was buried eventually, an old man in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Richmond, with the tag around his neck at his sister's insistence. She did not, that afternoon, cry. She thought, standing at the graveside with her own children beside her, that some things hold on exactly as long as they have to, and then they let go, and that letting go, when it finally comes, is not the opposite of loyalty. It is the last act of it. But that was much, much later. On that Tuesday morning at Gate B14, none of that had happened yet. There was only Aaron in the wheelchair, and Scout with his head across Aaron's thigh, and Carla on the floor beside them with the duffel across her knees, and Walt Brewer standing back a respectful 3 feet, and the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. The flight from Dulles, the one Aaron had originally been booked on, was still an hour out. The reporter, Danielle Ortega, was gone from the concourse. The gate had emptied of its passengers, who had, without being asked, drifted quietly toward the other end of the concourse to give the family room. A janitor named Miguel Torres, who had swept around Scout every Tuesday for the previous 97 Tuesdays, was standing near the wall with his broom over his shoulder, watching with his hat in his hand. Aaron, after a while, looked up at Walt. "Sir," he said, "I don't know your name." Walt smiled. "Brewer," he said. "Walt." "Walt," Aaron said. He nodded once. He looked down at Scout. He looked back up. "Walt, thank you." Walt started to say, "It wasn't me." He was going to say that Angela had brought the blanket, and Miguel had swept the floor, and Dr. Hess had come every Thursday for 103 weeks, and Bryce, whom Aaron had not yet met, was in the corner learning something he was going to spend the rest of his life applying. He was going to say that 100 people had taken care of Scout, and that he, Walt, had only been the one whose name happened to be on the door. He didn't say any of that. He knew, looking at Aaron, that Aaron would hear it later at his own pace, from Carla and from the reporter and from the dog. What Aaron needed right now was a small thing to hold on to. "You're welcome," Walt said instead. "Welcome home, son." Aaron nodded again. His hand was still in Scout's coat. He was rubbing slowly the same spot behind Scout's ear that he had rubbed the night before he had gotten on the charter to Norfolk, on the floor of a small apartment on the south side of Richmond, with a pizza box on the coffee table and an old baseball game on the television. Scout closed his eyes. He had waited long enough. Walt walked quietly to the departures board and reached up and, with a black marker he took from his shirt pocket, drew a small line under the words Gate B14. He would never explain what the line was for. Anyone who worked the concourse for the next 5 years knew without being told. Anyone who came new was told on their first day by Angela, whose voice would go a little soft when she said it. "That gate is Scout's gate. You work around it." Miguel Torres put his hat back on his head. He crossed himself once and went back to his broom. The morning flight from Charlotte began its final descent. The gate agent at B12 began her boarding announcement for the next departure. The world, having stopped for 11 long minutes on a piece of polished tile in a Virginia airport, began to move again. Carla stood up. She held out her hand to Walt. Walt took it. He helped her balance while she wiped one more time at her face. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Come by the office before you go." She said she would. She turned to her brother. She said, "All right. Ready?" He said, "Yeah." He put both hands on the arms of the wheelchair. She stepped behind him. She started to push. Scout walked beside the chair, on his good shoulder on the side away from the traffic. He did not need a leash. He was not going to need one ever again. He walked with his head at exactly the height of Aaron's hand, and every third or fourth step, without ever being asked, he leaned in just a little and let Aaron feel him. They went down the concourse. They went past B12, where the boarding agent had stopped in the middle of her announcement to watch. They went past the newsstand and the smoothie stand and the little shop that sold peanuts in tin cans. They went past the security checkpoint, where 2 TSA officers who had been on duty 2 years earlier, on the March morning it all started, stepped forward silently to walk them the last 30 feet to the exit. At the sliding glass doors, Carla stopped. She turned the wheelchair gently so that Aaron could look back down the concourse one more time. He looked. He saw in the distance the departures board at gate B14 and the empty spot on the floor beside the wall where the blanket in the color of his unit patch had been folded for 2 years. He looked at the spot for a long moment. Then he looked at the dog beside him. Scout was already looking at him. Aaron reached down and touched the brass tag against the dog's chest. He said, quiet enough that only Carla heard it, "All right, buddy, let's go home." The doors opened. The Virginia air came in warm and smelling of asphalt and cut grass and faintly of jet fuel. Carla pushed the chair through the doors. Scout walked out beside it. The doors slid shut behind them. 2 years, 1 month, and a promise a man had made to a dog on a March night in a small apartment on the south side of Richmond, kept in every part that could be kept. Some promises are made in words. Most of the ones that matter are made without any. They are made in the way a hand rests on the top of a head. They are made in the way a body leans in on a walk. They are made in the way a dog picks a piece of floor and holds it, past reason, past comfort, past the point where anyone else has any right to expect him to. If this story moved you the way it moved me telling it, do me one favor before you go. Leave a comment about a promise that was kept in your own life when it didn't have to be. Give this video a like so more people find it. And subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this one coming, and I don't want you to miss a single one.